Nick and Helen when I was a young greenhorn coming here to Boulder in 1989, 1990, when you had just kind of launched this idea of ETown as well.
Well, I grew up near Pete Seeger, and so Pete Seeger was a great model for me in many, many ways. Not just as a musician and a sort of great connector of dots, musical and cultural, but also as somebody who decided to use music for to affect social change, societal change, environmental change. So he was really an uninvited but very profound mentor for me when I was a little kid.
When I graduated, I always had in the back of my mind that I was just kind of biding my time at college, getting a practical a degree as young girls did back then. And then I beat feet out to Colorado, and some friends of mine who had graduated in June when you were supposed to had contacted me, and they had been on their way to Aspen. And they said, we heard about this other place, and we're here now, and you've got to come out, and you've got to check it out. It's called Telluride. And they just paved Main Street. They turned it from dirt to pavement, and they just replaced the wooden sidewalks with concrete. And we think this is really going to be a happening place. It's going to be a ski area that's really going to be something. So I went thinking I was just going to go for a few weeks, and I ended up staying for 15 years. Yeah. And I did theater and music, and did things on the side, including living in a little cabin in the outskirts of, 15 miles out of town, with no running water, no insulation, an outhouse. I hauled my water, I chopped my wood, and that's how I subsisted. But I only had to pay $25 a month, and that meant that I could do, I could afford to be a professional performer in Telluride, so I did that. But also I got involved early on in the Bluegrass Festival in Telluride in my kind of mid to later 20s, and just sort of fell into being one of the owners and producers of that. And for years, it was very, very small at that time, and it was very kind of hands-on, grassroots. I've been involved in a lot of things like that, actually. It's sort of my pattern or my path. And so I just said, oh, gosh, let me help. And I created all these systems, and I ended up producing that for a number of years.
She called me.
Yeah, and so I called him,
weeks
and it was like I'm very old-fashioned. It was the first guy I had ever called to say, "Excuse me, but I left a message." And
the first thing when we finally spoke, I said, "I understand you're married, young lady."
Yeah, he did.
What are your intentions?
He did. I thought, which I really appreciated. I thought this is a guy of integrity. He's an honorable man. He's obviously heard that I was married, but our divorce was, how it is, you live in a town of 1,000 people, you don't want to be the gossip on the corner, so we were keeping it very, very low-key, our separation and divorce, and I said, well, that's neither here nor there, I'm just calling about that cup of tea we had talked about having. And again, it was like, I knew I was supposed to know him, but it wasn't like, ooh, I have a crush on him, although you'd like me to say that was the case. It was more about, for some reason I knew that I had something to learn. And I didn't know if it was a day or a week or a year or a lifetime, but as it's turned out, it's a big chunk of time. We've been together for a quarter of a century, and I hope it is a lifetime.
More, like 26.
It'll be 26 this summer, yeah.
Now, were you living in Boulder at the time, or you were
I was living in Boulder
with Hot Rise?
I had for many, by then I'd been with Hot Rise for a long time. And I was a real catch, actually, at the moment. I was a wildly successful bluegrass musician. I was a divorced single father of 3 living with my mom on 8th and Spruce. And so when Helen finally came to Boulder and we got to meet, the first thing I told her was, I said, look, there's my mom's house, there's my room. And then the next day I said, here's my 3 kids, 4, 7, and 9, 3 little blonde girls. This is me. And I tried my best to dissuade her and didn't succeed, thankfully.
Tell us about the kind of the germination of ETown and what drove you to bring the eco message in.
The germination of the idea came from a tour. Hot Rize disbanded in 1990, and the very next day after our quote-unquote farewell concert, I left for Europe with Sam Bush and John Cowan and Laurie Lewis to do a tour organized by the State Department of Eastern Europe and Turkey and other places. And on that trip, I was reminded of two things. One is, music has the power to connect people across every boundary and every border and every socioeconomic divide we can put up. And that was very palpable in Eastern Europe in 1990. The wall had just come down. People were not clear on who was on what side and who got along with whom, and there was a lot of tension. And so we played to full houses, to very enthusiastic audiences, and we brought these very disparate crowds together. And so that was a very palpable reminder of the power of music, number one. Number two, I got to see firsthand what Eastern Europe looked like when government and industry are exactly the same. We're getting close, but when government and industry are exactly the same, there is a palpable negative effect on the environment. When I came back, I had this idea, I know we'll use the power of music to bring people together, and we'll talk about things we need to do to ensure that what we have won't turn into what they have in Eastern Europe, because it scared me. And it seemed like such a genius idea that I called NPR and I said, hey, it's Nick Forster from Hot Rize, and I've got a fabulous idea for you, this program. It's going to be music and environment and fabulous. You're going to give me a big check, right? And they literally just said, you know, please go away. We decided to record our first show on Earth Day in 1991, and we just went through our Rolodex and called up a bunch of friends and started. NPR eventually called back and said, hey, we just changed our mind. Love the show, want the show, when can you start? We're ready. And so that's when Helen and I jumped in with both feet, and in our first season, we produced 13 shows that featured people like Sean Colvin and Lyle Lovett and James Taylor and lots of others, because we called in all our chits from our friends. And I interviewed scientists from NCAR and Amory Lovins and, you know, a wide variety of people talking about the stuff that we needed to learn more about. We talked about climate change, and we talked about sustainable agriculture, and we talked about renewable energy and conservation and all these issues. And we presented all this great music, and then we ran out of money, and then we went off the air. And that was almost the end of the story.
We didn't have a long-range business plan. We didn't have, you know, it was just sort of, we were kind of trusting just trusting. You know, again, it's that knowing. And so early on, we wanted to have an element where we were celebrating people who were doing things that were helping others or protecting the earth, or just demonstrating sustainability and the success they had in that. So eventually it evolved into this thing that, for those of you who are not familiar with the program, it's called the E-Achievement Award. It's a play on the word achievement, and of course it's E-Town. So we appeal to our listeners to tell us about people that they either knew, maybe it was your cousin or your sister, or maybe it was somebody you just read about, but send us some stories. And we started doing a lot of research and so forth, and I just sort of grabbed that because it was sort of floating out there, and I thought, oh, let me just see what I can do with it. We come from a place of service. ETown is about a place of service, so for any artist that's on, we want to get their music out there and get them exposure in media. And similarly with the Achievement Award, we want to get these stories out and get people excited about and interested about what they're doing and support them.
Nick, you were just talking a little bit earlier that early on there might have been that moment when you didn't know if you were going to be able to carry on. How did you push through that?
Oh, there's been lots of moments like that.
And not just early on.
I think in the realm of social entrepreneurship, you know, there is this fundamental collision between risk taking and not being willing to compromise. You know, so it's a collision course that is often, you know, the responsible for some calamitous results. We've been lucky in that we've worked our way through most of those dangerous thresholds. But the most dangerous of all was that first year when we ran out of dough, we went off the air. to add insult to injury, we had a sort of fledgling foundation approach us and sign a contract for substantial support for us. Enough so that we went to NPR and we said, hey, good news, we're back in the black, we got money, we're going to commit to a whole 39 show season, we're back on the air, sign us up. So we signed a contract with NPR for another, 3 times as many shows that we produced in our first season, because we thought we had this funding. The funding turned out to be sort of more vapor than substance. And so we were really in a jam where we had a commitment to produce 39 new shows and no money and a little debt from the previous season. So that's when Paul Rapetto, one of our board members, said, I think you should go to Expo West, Natural Products Expo West, and record a show. And because what you do is so aligned with the natural products arena, and so many of the players are from Boulder, and you ought to go. And I said, great, it's going to cost, $25,000 for us to mount a whole production and book music and staging and the lights and the PA and a recording truck. So we worked it out. We figured out a way to find some local sponsors to help us cover those costs. We did our first show at Natural Products Expo in 1992. And as a result of that first show, right after that I went around and introduced myself to a variety of different, in those days, in the early days of the Expo, you go to the Ben & Jerry's booth, well, there's Ben & Jerry. You go to Tom's and Maine booth, there's Tom. And so all the founders were there, and I was able to create connections with a variety of people that resulted in significant support for us. One of the things that we're really proud of with ETown is that shortly after we were launched and everything was better and we had some sponsorship, NPR dropped us. So they were our big distributor, and they just said, hey, we're getting rid of a lot of shows, including yours. So at first...
well, let me just interject that was at a time when, do you remember the contract for America? We used to call it the contract on America. Well, they were gunning after CPB, which is the Corporation for Public Broadcast. And so everybody was scrambling, and NPR cut, I think it was 40% of their cultural programming package, including Afro-pop, Blue Stage, and on down the line. And we almost made the cut because we were growing at such a phenomenal rate at the time. But then they just basically were cutting anything that was controversial or kind of scary.
One of the greatest challenges, those of us who believe in this message and this language, as Steve was talking about, one of the great challenges is to how do you first package that message so it can be concise and palpable and understandable. And second, how do you reach beyond those who already agree with you in such a way so that you're welcoming? And that's part of what we believe we have, we're working on it still, but I think because music is our calling card, music is our Trojan horse that gets us into cars and homes all across America, we can have that conversation in a way that isn't threatening. I first approached the city about trying to buy this building for ETown in 1991, right after we started. And it had been Unity Church, and Unity Church was moving into their new facility, so they put it on the market. And I went to the city and I said, hey, this is kind of intriguing, and we just started this nonprofit, it's wacky, but can we do this? And they said, you can buy it, you just can't use it, because you're not a church. And then eventually, I was so frustrated, I did go back to the city, and I said, look, I really want to do this. And they said, well, you can't, because you're not a church. There's no parking, it's a residential neighborhood. So I went online and I got ordained, and it took 5 minutes. And then I went back to the city and I said, here's my certificate of ordination. Reverend Nick Forster, it says right there. We're a 501c3. Churches are 501c3, so the IRS doesn't see any difference between us and a church. We do most of our events on Sunday evenings. We celebrate good works in the community, and we do a lot of singing. And so, you want us to be a church? No problem. We're a church.
Nick was so persistent and so passionate about attaining this building for the organization, because it was becoming apparent that our model was becoming outdated. We started this, we were renting the Boulder Theater, we were selling tickets, we were covering our costs. We're a very entrepreneurial nonprofit, so We got local sponsors, national sponsors. We had ticket revenue. We wrote grants. We just kept it churning and going. But after a while, it was becoming more and more expensive to rent the theater. It was just cost prohibitive, and it was just not an efficient system anymore. And things were changing. So radio hasn't gone away. But if you ask a 20-year-old, what station do you listen to? They don't listen to a station. They're on Spotify or YouTube or iTunes or whatever, and it became apparent that it was time to no longer be gypsies, but to actually set down some roots and come up with the ability to take this building and transform it into something that is really meant to be a place for respectful dialogue. It's what we've always represented on the program. But this is a place where content can be made beyond the radio program and reach a number of different types of people, different generations, and with that idea of bringing people together and creating respectful dialogue. Agree to disagree, but let's talk about it, So.